This is the English Wine Collection's Wine Talks British Business podcast series. Simon Berry is from the famous wine company Berry Brothers and Rudd. With its impressive family lineage, the company has been at the forefront of the wine industry since its inception. There are many memorable moments from his career, including the story behind serving a 1961 Margaux at a state banquet. Perhaps most importantly for Simon, he states that wine is one of the great joys in life, and that when in business, new ideas have to keep coming through, which includes the next generation. Simon, thank you for putting some time aside to be part of the English Wine Collection's Wine Talks British Business.
Pleasure.
Can you talk me through your career? Where did it all start for you and run through to where we are today?
That might take as long as we've got. It goes all the way back. Well, I suppose it goes all the way back to practically when I was born. Having the extraordinary privilege of being the only son of a family that's been involved in the wine business for over 300 years.
Mm-hmm.
It was sort of destined that I would go in into this. My sister, who was staying here this weekend, is still very cross about the fact that the wine trade was a very masculine world in those days. Not anymore, and it wasn't actually 300 years ago. One of the things that makes her even more cross is that Berry Brothers and Rudd was founded by a woman. So it was my advantage that I was sort of the only boy left to go into this amazing firm. And it was always sort of, my father made it very plain that this was really what I was put on earth to do. Which is actually rather a sort of double-edged sword. I did rebel against it. I mean, I felt I first joined Berry's in 1976 when I was 19 years old. And there was a feeling that this was what I was going to do, which if you're 19, you want to make up your own mind and you want to plough your own furrow. And there are plenty of other things I wanted to do. And I came into the firm, and after a year, I said, I don't think I want to be here anymore.
Okay.
Which my mother was very upset about. She said, well, it's a very good, respectable business. And I wanted to be an actor. That's what I really wanted to do. And that was, of course, a very disrespectful. I mean, there was it was very bad to be an actor. In some ways, she was completely right. I've been involved in the theatre for a long time, and I understand that it's really a horrible profession, and you really shouldn't encourage your children to go on the stage at all. But as far as I was concerned, that was much more important. And as far as my father was concerned, it was as if I said, I don't know if you're aware of this, but I'm actually a Martian. He completely ignored it. He thought it was so mad that I was not going to take up what to him was the most wonderful job in the entire world. That I was obviously mad, and it was a passing phase, and I'd grow out of it. But away I went for in the end, about 2.5 years, really proving to myself that the real problem I had about being an actor is that I really didn't have what is quite important, which is talent. I was not nearly good enough to get close to it. And eventually I came back to the firm, largely because I realised, I think, that what fascinated me was the company.
Okay.
I'd always been very aware that the wine trade was full of passionate people who knew an enormous amount about wine. And I always felt a bit of a fraud amongst them because I didn't know a huge amount about wine. I didn't have a wonderful palate. It was a commodity to me in those days, perhaps. Actually, what fascinated me was this firm which had been around for 300 odd years, not quite at that stage, and how it had evolved and how it was a sort of living organism, as it were. And that's why I came back, and I think that's what my career at Berry's was all about from that point onwards. So this was early 80s. And I then was there for another 37 years. And in that time, things changed a lot. I mean, when I first went into it, it was a very, very, very old-fashioned company, probably out of survival. I mean, there were a lot of companies going back to the post-war era which hadn't had the ability to be able to consolidate, and most of those had gone bust. And one of the reasons why Berry's kept on going through those unbelievably difficult times was that it was run by very old-fashioned people like my father, who was very cautious businessman, would never take a risk, hated change.
Okay.
But because, he and his generation had been through with the war, and they'd seen an awful lot of change, they'd seen an awful lot of risks.
Yeah.
And so their idea was preservation, conservation, if you like, in the old-fashioned sense of the word. And I once described Berry's in those days as being, it was like going into a garage and finding out that behind all of the old sofas and things like that you had at the front of the garage was a vintage Rolls-Royce.
Okay.
Which wasn't running, but didn't really need very much doing to it to make it extraordinary.
Yeah.
And I was lucky enough to sort of be at Berry's at that time. And there was this sort of belief that if you were old-fashioned, then you shouldn't change. Mm-hmm. And I can remember thinking, well, who created that rule precisely? I mean, why if you are a traditional wine merchant and all of the great things that go with that, why can't you change? And I mean, we were the first company to have a website.
Yeah.
We had a website in 1994.
Okay. Which
was before Google, it was before our Amazon. It was even before the English wine collection. I mean, it was. I mean, I can remember people looking at me and saying, "You must be mad. What this internet? What is this thing?" I mean, my father insisted on calling it the intranet, mainly to annoy me, I suspect, not knowing that was a thing too. And it was that ability. And the people who were working for us, because we had attracted some really talented people to come and work for us, to sort of take an old-fashioned wine firm and keep the things that still made sense and change the things that were going to update it, which I think was probably the mark of the last 25 years at Berry's.
So there was a bit of key involvement that you think you had?
Well, I hope so. I was fascinated. I mean, I've been listening to your other interviews, which have all been terribly good. I hope this isn't going to be a huge disappointment. I don't know how time will tell. But one of the things that everybody talked about, whether the wonderful Cliff Robeson, I thought was fascinating, or Napoli Rankin, and all things like that, Jeremy Ritchie, they all tended to talk about two things. These were things that came up in all of those interviews. Firstly, about the need for change. I mean, someone like Cliff has never stopped changing his entire life and has been brilliant at that, reinventing things in so many different parts of the wine trade. But also how important it is for the wine trade in particular to understand the past and not to rush at changing things immediately and too quickly and changing the wrong things. And one of the things that a family business does, to my mind, is it gives you that opportunity to think about the long term, because you don't have lots of shareholders going, but I want my dividend this week, and it's very important that change happens quickly. Yeah. So you can have this long-term view where you can actually think, what's the right thing to do now for my children and the next generation, and what do I wish my parents' generation had done? And it just gives you a long-term that perspective. But at the same time, family needs to innovate. Natalie, who I've just finished listening to, was talking about how she was the person who comes up with the ideas. And I think that's a really, really important thing. One of my fascinations is family businesses, and I've been involved with a few and known a lot of people who have been involved with things. And as far as I'm concerned, the kiss of death of a family business is when they are the people who go out and employ other people to have ideas.
Okay.
They should be the people who are continually going, oh, why don't we try this? Why don't we do or that? And they need to employ people who are going to go, you don't want to do that. That's the most appalling idea I've ever heard in the whole of my life. Or, actually, that could work. And maybe if we did this and we did that, we could achieve something different and special. And that combination, as opposed to going out to employ people who go, okay, I want to make my stamp. I mean, I've seen so many, not just family firms, I've seen so many firms go wrong about this. Because if you employ somebody new, very bright, the first thing they want to do is to make their stamp.
Yes, yeah.
And prove how much better they are than anybody else who's been there before. And some of them are brilliant, but quite a lot of them just don't understand the DNA of the company, the soul of the company.
Which is family, I'm picking up on.
Well, family, but yeah, family do, because it's been rammed down your throat since you were 3 years old. I mean, you understand it, whether you big enough and clever enough to actually go out and employ the people who can do the things that you can't do.
Sure.
Is a different question. But the one thing that, if you've been well brought up by your parents to understand the way the family fits into the business and the business fits into the family, then you have, almost without thinking of it, an understanding of the soul of that business. And that's a really good place to start changing things from.
You've mentioned a lot about family, and obviously that is Berry Brothers or Rudd. And your father has had a very big impact on the business and on yourself. I believe he introduced you to wine at a very young age.
Yes.
Right? Can you remember what he first served you?
I can not only remember what he first served me. Yeah, I can remember the occasion. I can remember almost everything about it, which is strange because I can't remember an awful lot of things at my age. But yeah, it was Christmas 1961. And it wasn't terribly distinguished. It was a bottle of 1966 Morgon Beaujolais.
Yeah.
And, I almost certainly it was watered down. So it was probably 90% water and then just a tiny little drop of this, which is very much the French way of introducing people to introducing children to wine. And a very good way of doing it, incidentally.
I've got here that your father introduced it to you as Jolly Boys.
Jolly Boys.
Is that right?
Jolly Boys. Where did you get that? You've done very good research. Jolly Boys, yes, that was how it was. That was his.
Did you enjoy it?
Nickname. Well, it sounded like such a fun drink.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, no, I can remember that occasion. I can't remember what it tasted like, but I'm telling
you. Do you remember that?
I remember that.
I wanted to carry on with one more thing about your father, because he's clearly had such a big impact on you. And I just get this quote right. I've got here, so it's a phrase that must have been of paramount importance to your father. And that is, on his tombstone, "'Tis not the coffer that holds the true wealth."
It's the cask, not the coffer, that holds the true wealth. Which is a quote from Omar Khayyam. And he was, my father believed, and I think it's so true, that in the end, the wine trade especially isn't about money. It's about the joy of wine. I mean, it was fascinating hearing Cliff again talking about quality and how important it was for him that everything he did, even when he was producing pink sparkling Pinot Grigio, a wine that I don't think my father even knew existed, let alone but how important it was for Cliff that it should have been the best.
Of course.
And an awful lot of people, not necessarily in the wine trade, I think the wine trade is pretty good at understanding that, but there's an awful lot of people in other trades who don't understand that, and who actually think, no, how can we make it cheaper? How can we make it, how can we cut corners because everybody's just interested in the cheapest thing. And I was on your website and reading what you were writing about English wine. And I think one of the things that you said, which is so true, that if you just look at right now how much English wine can cost, you forget about so much more. And, the idea that, and you said, I think, that the English wine tends to start at sort of above £10.
Yeah.
Which is more expensive than the average wine sells for in a supermarket. But actually the quality of it is so high. The enjoyment you get from it is so great.
Yeah.
That if more people just thought, what am I going to do with that extra 50p? I mean, one of the things that I find fascinating is the story of Fever Tree.
Okay.
And this understanding that Charles Rolls had, that if people were suddenly beginning to spend a lot more on gin, and I mean, it's sort of, I mean, I don't think anybody spent more than about £10 a bottle on gin when this all began. But then suddenly people were spending £30.
Yeah.
And going, oh, this is much better and much. And actually realising that £30 on a bottle of gin, you drink gin in a very different way than you drink wine.
Of course, yeah.
So actually, you probably drink it 6 times as slowly as you drink wine, or you get, when you mix it, you get a quantity that's about 6 times as great. So a £30 bottle of gin, sort of about the same as spending £5 on a bottle of wine. And the quality goes up and up and up. And for him to then go, okay, well, if people have got that, if they've understood that, then aren't they going to also be prepared to spend a bit more to increase the quality of the tonic water that goes into the gin?
Yeah.
And that has made, it's been a huge success.
Well, it's all part of making the entire drink much more appealing and then having more rapport.
Yeah, and it's understanding as well. It sort of goes back to what we were talking about beginning to drink wine at an early age. If you do that, you understand that wine isn't just fermented grape juice that gets you pissed.
Yes.
It's part of... I once said that to a whole bit of Americans, and of course they think gets you pissed means makes you annoyed.
Oh.
What was it? Oscar Wilde said it's two nations divided by a common language. And I worked out in that moment that was very true. Anyway, wine is it's one of the great joys of life. And once you understand that, and I think it does help if you are brought up with it as part of not this sort of great teenage rebellion. I mean, alcohol, it seems to me, very often is how you assert yourself as being different from your parents because you're now grown up enough to...
Okay, yeah. You can make the choice yourself.
To make the choice yourself, which is why so many generations don't drink what their parents drink, which is one of the great truths of the alcohol trade. So if you can understand that wine is a part of, it's one of the great things in life, then suddenly the cost of things begins to be questioned a bit more.
Yeah.
And, people, I used to, when I still lived in London, I used to go to the football a lot. And, I'd sit in a stadium with 60,000 people, most of whom the idea of spending £20 on a bottle of wine meant nothing to them at all. But they were perfectly happy to spend £80 on a ticket to sit and watch their team be beaten every Saturday. And that was just another... that going to the opera. Unbelievably expensive.
Yeah.
It means nothing to me at all. But to some people, that's the most important thing in the entire world. So once you get it's a car. There's a very long way of replying to what's on my father's gravestone. The point about 'tis a cask, not the coffer that holds the true wealth, is that don't always think about how much it costs or how much money it's making you or all of that, and then
about the true worth.
Yeah, absolutely. Omar Khayyam also wrote, which I think is even truer, but wouldn't fit on the gravestone. I wonder what the vintner buys one half as precious as the stuff he sells, which again is lovely. And
that is a great quote.
You should have that above your desk.
Simon, you've been clerk to the Royal, were clerk to the Royal Cellars since 2008.
Yeah.
Can you tell me about that role?
No.
Are you sure?
Yes, I'm absolutely sure. That's part of my job description.
Carrying on with this train then, so there's a whole team, obviously, I imagine, including yourself, who are in charge of the royal household, the wine committee, etc. How does it work when you're selecting wine?
Oh, all right. Well, I can't tell you that because that's out in the public domain. Pleasure. How do it work? As you say, there is a committee, which I have been on for, probably 30 years now. And that's basically made up of representatives from the Royal Warrant Holding wine companies and one or two others who we bring along. And we will taste blind samples sent in by the wine warrant holding companies. So, for example, we will say we need more Saucer. And I will then send an email to all of the warrant holding companies, of whom there are 7 at the moment, I think, and say this is what we want, this is how much we want to pay. Okay. Send along a couple of samples so we can have a tasting, and we'll have anything up to 3 tastings a year where we bring all these samples together and we mark them all, and then once they're all marked, then we'll reveal what the wines were, and then we'll work out how much we're going to buy of them. And if there's a big difference in price, maybe we'll say, okay, well, this one came second, but actually the price is very big. What people think is that we're buying wines for the Queen to drink, which is not, it's only a tiny part of the equation. What we're basically doing is we're buying wines for receptions and other events to take place in the royal palaces. So it's much more like buying wine for a hotel, if you like.
For events.
It's for events. And actually the ones that get all the publicity, which are when you get a state visit, they don't come from our cellars at all, because it's a state visit, and the government have got cellars much more extensive and full of much more expensive wines as well. And I then get to go and choose some of the wines that will be served at the state banquets. But they're not ones that the Royal Household Wine Committee have bought.
Is it quite an extensive process? Is there a large board of you?
No.
People?
Well, no, as I say, there are about 6 or 7 of us on the committee, and then there are probably another 3 or 4 people in the household. So it's all controlled by the keeper of the privy purse, who's the man who's got the money and says, okay, well, you're allowed to spend this on that and that and that.
This is the royal budget, as it were.
This is the royal budget.
Any particular memorable bottles
that we bought?
Yes.
Well, as I say, not really, because it's much more sort of wines for drinking now. Certainly when it's come to buying, to choosing wine to serve at the royal banquets, then there have been some amazingly memorable bottles. And it's always quite an interesting diplomatic dance you do as to who's going to get what. What can I tell you about that without being hauled off to the Tower of London? We had, I think, in a way, we had a wonderful time. When President Sarkozy came across, the person who was sort of the guardian of the government cellars had a reputation for protecting the very, very, very best stuff, not allowing it out. It was very secretive about what was in there. You can now look it all up online. I mean, it's all out there. But at this time, it was my first banquet. It was all kept very quiet. And I can remember my predecessor saying to me, well, they've got some 1961 Margot. And I said, well, that'd be perfect. You've got the President of France appearing. And he said, good luck with that. I've been trying to get hold of that for a very long time. So I went to see the man who I didn't know at all, who had become a very good friend since life, who looks after all of this, and sat down, and he said, have you got any thoughts about what we're going to be drinking when Sarkozy comes? And I said, well, of course, Sarkozy himself is teetotaler and doesn't touch a drop. And he said, yes, that's true. And I said, but of course, Carla, his new wife at that stage, will be coming too, and she loves wine, apparently. And he said, yes, yeah. And I said, and of course, she's Italian. So what Italian wines have you got in the cellar? And he said, we've got 300 French people appearing at Windsor Castle, and if we serve them Italian wine, there's going to be a diplomatic incident. We can't do that. So I said, fine, 1961 Margot. And he said, who told you we got that? I got my soritis. He said, no, you can't have that. I said, who else are you going to serve it to? You've got the President of France. You've just said you've got all these Frenchmen appearing. And he went, okay, all right. And they drank. I didn't get to go to that particular banquet, but Francis Robinson did. And they drank 1961 Margot, worth God knows how much, bought for practically nothing, because it's so well managed, that cellar, that they're always buying on the Primeur. They've got a different committee who are all brilliant, included at one stage, I'm not sure if it does anymore, but there were wine buyers for the major supermarkets. It was an extraordinarily well put together committee, and they have bought this sort of national asset, which is very, very, very useful for diplomatic relations, and they've bought it for nothing. They should all be given knighthoods, frankly, as far as I'm concerned.
The most amazing wines.
The most amazing wines, but not very. The problem is, of course, that it then becomes a political football. And at one stage, everybody thought, oh, this is very embarrassing, because all of the people on the left thought it was being drunk by the Tory toffs, and all of the Tory toffs thought it was being drunk by John Prescott. So suddenly people were going, oh, we've got to sell it. This is an embarrassment, as opposed to saying, this is a national treasure, and we are really lucky to have got this. Anyway, so that's a memorable bottle.
It certainly is.
Which I never got to drink, but I'm told was very good by chances.
You've had a lifetime in wine, and it's also on the back of your family. Do you see this tradition continuing? Do you think Berry Brothers will continue to have your own blood, forgive me for putting it that way, but it will carry on forward?
Well, I hope so. I mean, it's not just my blood. I don't have any children, but my nephews and my sister, who's very cross that she didn't get into the firm. I always mob her up about this, because she lacked a bit like I lacked the talent to become an actor. My sister is what I think is referred to as geographically challenged. She doesn't understand geography at all. She thought at one point that Torquay was the capital of Japan. I'm not making that up. She warned me about going to North Carolina because she found an atlas somehow. I'm not quite sure she knew where to find it, but she'd looked it up and found out that it was next to Georgia, and was very worried because the Russians had just invaded Georgia. Anyway, so finding our way to Bordeaux would have been a bit of a problem. However, her son is infinitely better at geography than she is, and he's in the company. And of course, we mustn't forget the Rudds. We really mustn't forget the Rudds.
Of course, yeah.
The Rudds own most of the firm, and Lizzie Rudd, the daughter of my father's old partner, John Rudd, is the chairman right now, and her brother is in the firm as well. One of her brothers. And my cousin Christopher was chairman before me, who was a huge influence on the firm. And there are children and grandchildren.
Of course,
and so there will be enough to choose from.
There certainly will.
And luckily, when I was growing up, there wasn't anybody else to choose from at all but families. Otherwise, I'm sure they would have found out I was not geographically challenged, perhaps, but mathematically challenged. I wouldn't have had that job.
What do you think's coming next for you? What are your
for me?
Yeah, what are your future plans?
I have retired. I'm coasting gently down to death. No, I'm not. I mean, no, I seriously am not. One of the things I did is I retired on my 60th birthday for a number of reasons, principally because both my father and John Rudd had retired on their 90th birthdays, and I thought I needed to balance things out a bit. Because actually, again, any firm, but family firms especially, you need to bring the young blood in. You need to, it's their turn. And actually, another thing that family firms get wrong is not doing that. And the classic pattern is that you come into a firm when you're in your early 20s or in late teens and full of ideas, most of which aren't great, but some of which are fantastic. And you then spend the next 20 years with the generation above you going, what a stupid idea. I've never had that. Ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. Wait your turn. And so 20 years on, you finally go, it's my turn at last.
Yeah.
And the next generation was there going, I've had this really wonderful idea. And you go, no, absolutely not. It's my turn now. Wait your turn. Your turn will come. And you've got to break that cycle. You really have. It is lethal. It destroys more family businesses than anything else. And I was lucky in that actually it wasn't necessarily my father, but my cousin did encourage people to come through and listen to new ideas, and was sort of one of the first people to go out and employ non-family board members who, again, were given the brief to be that important filter of taking the ideas, putting them into a business context and doing things like that. But I felt that 60 was the right time. I'm the most important person to clear that with, of course, was my wife, who had to put up with me for a lot longer than maybe she'd been calculating. I know. And it is, I mean, whatever trade you're in, and the wine trade is no different. New ideas have to come through, and new ideas have to, and you've got to be given the chance to make mistakes. And actually, it's the job of the elder generation to go out and make sure that there are brilliant people who they've already employed in the company who's going to guide that and who are going to make that work. So I planned for about 10 years to leave on my 60th birthday. Actually, a bit more. I was in my late 40s when I made up my mind that that was what I wanted to do if I could organise it. And I'm delighted that I have. And although I think I've never thought, so now's the time for me to become an actor. I think that ship has sailed. I was very involved. I was on the board of RADA and very involved in that world. But what that sort of sublimated itself into is that I've always wanted to write.
Okay.
and I'm writing plays. That's what I fill my world.
Currently.
One of which may even get off the page.
Marvellous.
It's so likely that I could probably tell you more about being clerk to the Royal Cellars than about this, because it seriously might happen. But so I've got to keep very quiet about it. And I'm writing something about the history of berries, but from a specific point of view. It's looking at George Berry, who was my great grandfather, who was the first of the Berry family he was the son of somebody who'd married into the company that was in St James's Street at that stage. And we don't know very much about him. You may think it's a bit of a problem if you're going to write a whole book about him, but it's much more about, I suppose, the wine trade throughout the 19th century.
Yeah.
Which I do know a bit about him. And how it was a time of unbelievable change.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody says now, there's never been a decade where things have changed more. Nonsense. And especially as far as wine is concerned. And equally, people say, and this is again one of the going back to the dichotomy of wine, that it's very modern and very old at the same time. People think, people have been drinking wine forever. I mean, invented by the Phoenicians or the Georgians or whoever you would believe. But actually, wine as we recognise it is very, very, very new.
Yeah.
And fine wine, quotes, unquotes, is even newer. And if you go back to what was happening in 1800 and compare to what was happening in 1900, let alone what's happened in 1900 to 2000, the change was massive. And really it was the invention of wine as we knew it happened during that time. And George Berry, we always rather proudly said, well, his father was a wine merchant in Exeter. Go back to your county.
Yeah.
Being a wine merchant in Exeter, basically in 1800, basically meant you had a rowing boat.
Okay.
And when there was a new moon, you could row it out to the little ship just over the horizon, which had come from France, with whom we were at war, don't forget, and taking a cask of from that ship and very quietly rowing it back to shore before the excisemen. I mean, they were smugglers, basically.
Yeah.
And so this frightfully respectable idea of being a wine merchant in Exeter, you've got to look at it with a slightly different eye. Anyway, and that is a part of history I find fascinating, because it was such a new age.
Yeah.
Things were just changing so much. This house was built in 1798, and again, for its time, it was so new.
Sure.
Probably people thought it was hideous, and this modern thing which had been thrown up. I was listening to somebody yesterday who was saying that if we had the planning laws that we have now, Bath would never have been built. The planners would never have allowed everything as modern and as revolutionary as Bath to
Beautiful city.
It's a beautiful city now, but at the time it was new and it was modern, and it was, oh no, we can't have that.
Yeah.
So, go figure, as they say on the Isle of Manhattan.
So, thank you so much for your time. Is there anything you'd like to round up with?
No, I think I've said much too much already. Thank you.
No, thank you.